So my name is Gary Kinsman. I'm also living in Sudbury on the Tikamishin Anishinaabe territory. And I'm really pleased to be here at this panel today, and I think it's really important to mark this as a significant discussion that absolutely needs to be continued and to be expanded. And I think there's particular reasons why within autonomist, anarchist, and anti-authoritarian currents and circles over the last 5 or 6 years, you've actually seen a growing emphasis on questions of knowledge production and research. And it's not happening in the same ways. It certainly happened within the feminist movement in some very significant ways, but it's not happening in some very significant ways in other parts of the left, and I think there's particular reasons for that. I'm not going to address those today. What I want to do is to start in the usual place where I start when I talk these days, because I think that it's really important theoretically, methodologically, and politically to start with people and their doing. So I really find a quote from John Holloway to be really useful in terms of orienting our research and cutting through a lot of the bullshit that exists in the academic world. What he writes is, when we write and when we read, it is easy to forget that the beginning is not the word but the scream. Faced with the mutilation of human lives by capitalism, a scream of horror, a scream of anger, a scream of refusal, no! I like to start there because I think that immediately moves us out of all of the bureaucratic, professional, administrative bullshit around neutrality and objectivity in terms of the work that we start with. And it starts us in people's doings, because a scream is an activity that people are engaged in. So for me, this is a starting point for the type of research that we have to do. And what it means is that the research that we're producing is committed research. It's starting from the standpoint of oppressed and marginalized and exploited people's screams. In our discussions about militant and activist research, it's starting from the screams and the standpoints of activists and organizers in social movements. And we should be absolutely clear on that and not try to make any sort of reservations about it and try to kowtow in some weird way to objectivity and neutrality. Because I think that just gets in the way of what we're really trying to do. Now, I want to talk about a particular perspective and way of doing militant activist research that is related both to institutional ethnography and political activist ethnography, which people have probably never heard of before. And I'll pass around this little prop called Sociology for Changing the World, which is a book we put together a number of years ago. For those of you who have an aversion to sociology, just read it as anything else. I mean, it's actually not intended to be trapped within that particular disciplinary context. But I want to tell you a little bit about this approach and why I find it very useful in terms of doing political activist research. Institutional ethnography was developed by a Marxist feminist, socialist feminist by the name of Dorothy Smith. Maybe people haven't heard of her. But basically what she tried to do, to put it in a really quick way, is she tried to rewrite doing social science research so it would conform to the feminist method that the personal is political. To entirely rewrite what doing social research was about from that perspective. She used ethnographic forms of research. Now, ethnography, just to be really brief, is usually the study of other people's cultures, right? Where you go in and you learn the methods and practices of those cultures. What institutional ethnography does is to take those skills and capacities of ethnographic research, which are really profound, but to turn them as weapons against the ruling institutional relations in our society, right? To use them as weapons from the standpoints of oppressed and marginalized people in social movements, to figure out how it is that those institutional relations work so we can tear them to pieces and potentially put something else in place. This approach is similar in some important ways to participatory action research. It does have a commitment to trying to democratize research, but I think it also has other political dimensions that focus on trying to critique how ruling actually takes place. So in some ways, there's an overlap, but there's also a movement beyond participatory action research that's part of this approach. Another part of the approach is this notion that what we actually need to do for people is to produce mappings of the world, right? If you think about a map and you're using it, you're locating yourself within it. You always have a sort of context-dependent and reflexive relationship to a map if you're trying to go from one place to another. In the same way, that's the type of theorize and that's the type of analysis that we need to be able to produce so that people can always locate themselves within those mappings so that they're useful in terms of both figuring out where you're at and also where you might be going. Now, a student of Dorothy Smith's by the name of George Smith, no relation, developed an extension of institutional ethnography called political activist ethnography. Now, while institutional ethnography talks about developing knowledge for the standpoints of oppressed and marginalized people, what political activist ethnography has done is to try to figure out how we can develop knowledge for and as part of social movements, as activists. George Smith wrote an important reflection on his years of activism that's called Political Activist as Ethnographer, that was based on his activism in the gay liberation movement fighting police repression of queer sex, and also in the AIDS activist movement. I would encourage people to read that article if you're interested. It's included in the book that I passed around. Now, first of all, it's based on the notion that research is part of the everyday life of any activist organization and social movement. Part of what Aziz was saying is really important. I mean, just like Gramsci says, everyone is an intellectual. I don't like everything about Gramsci, but I do like his notion that everyone is an intellectual. Just like all activists are researchers, right? We're all talking about, like, what are we going to do next? We're all trying to theorize the situations we find ourselves in. That's already going on. Part of what political activist ethnography is about is to try to make that more explicit, to try to make that more clear, to try to move it away from some of the ways in which some of us get trapped within ideological ways of thinking or speculative ways of thinking. So just to read you a quote from the Sociology for Changing the World book that hopefully brings some of this into view for you. What we argue there is that one of the central propositions of political activist ethnography is that through confrontation with ruling regimes, activists are able to uncover aspects of their social organization. Through an analysis of the institutional relations movements are up against, more effective forms of activism can be developed. And we also argue that the test for whether or not research has been successful is the extent to which it enables people to transform the world. Right? So, I mean, this is a very different approach to research. One of the strands within sociology that people probably haven't heard of is breaching experiments that ethnomethodologists were interested in doing, which was intentionally defying social norms to see what the reaction would be, to disrupt social order, to fuck things up, right, to cause shit, right? That's part of what social movements are doing all the time, but they're also amazingly brilliant research knowledge production opportunities, because when we fuck shit up, we also see what the responses are. We see how things are socially organized. That's actually a conscious, I mean, it could become a very conscious research strategy in the everyday life of social movements. And in a certain sense, what this approach is about breaking down the distinctions between activists and researcher, right? So that all activists are researchers, and that researchers also need to be activists to be actually able to be producing this type of knowledge. Don't really have much time to talk about sort of mapping social relations of struggle, except to point out that I don't find 5 minutes left. I don't find social movement theory very useful in this project. I mean, much along the lines of what Aziz said, it constructs social movements as objects. It constructs a series of regulatory classification schemes for how you can slot different social movements. I think we actually need to build much more on the knowledge that's coming out of social movements, but also recognize that we sometimes need to be critical of that. Sometimes there is speculation and ideology that serve to justify what's going on. I mean, after the G20 protests, I was just amazed at the amount of speculative, ideological stuff that was being produced that had no basis at all in terms of how the police and national security regimes are actually organized. But nonetheless, some people base their activism on stuff that has no relationship to how things are socially organized. Part of this approach is to figure out how it's actually socially organized, right? Because then when you understand what you're up against, you can understand what you're challenging and what you can try to transform. Mapping social relations of struggle in the way in which I talked about it allows us to see both the social forces we're up against as well as to see all of our potential allies. It allows us to begin to see where the weak links are and where we could potentially push through.